Good morning. It's working? Okay. All right. I often behave very strangely when I'm handed microphones, so this is a whole other level of that. I will try not to go into my stand-up routine, which is what I often feel like doing when I'm feeling a bit more of stage fright. Well, so excited to be with y'all today in a different capacity than I typically play in my day-to-day role. And in my day-to-day life, I don't often prefer to be speaking to a lot of people. And one time, I prefer to speak to everyone through conversation. So bear with me if my voice changes over time. My name is Michelle Lugalia-Hollon. I met Patton. I can't remember when we met, but it was great. I also remember when we went and got tacos at Carnitas Lonhout, which has recently been recognized as a James Beard finalist in Texas. So credit you for that, for exposing me to that amazing meal. And Patton has often invited me to think a lot about things that I find myself sometimes too busy to spend time really cultivating and practicing and thinking intentionally about. A lot of us probably get caught up a lot in the work that we do, but I think sitting down with Patton always reminds me of the importance of taking time to, once you're out of school, revisit some of the sacred texts and some of the people who were influential, but some of the new information that's out there, and refresh and be reconvicted and recentered in some of the new ideas that are required for us to own the horizon. And so today he asked me to come talk about the concept of beloved community. How many of you guys have heard of the concept of beloved community? Excellent. So we'll work on this together. Patton asked me to walk through what it is, what it requires of us, where you've seen it expressed, and where I've seen it being squelched or unrealized. So I saw some hands coyly going up, and I'd love to hear from those folks who put their hands up based on what they know about beloved community. How would you define what beloved community is? So what does beloved community mean to you? I saw a lot of hands. I should have prefaced by telling you that it was going to be a pop quiz afterwards, but anyone? What does beloved community mean to you? Being in alignment with each other. You can just call it out. The Lord says. A little louder. Yes. Great. That's perfect. She said creating space, and that means being able to be aware and being able to adjust based on the needs of those who are in your community. Anyone else? Becca? Great. Building relationships and surrounding yourself with people who are able to nourish you and support you and be a part of the work that we all need to join hands and do to support ourselves. And so I learned about beloved community through the work of Martin Luther King and through his speeches and through his preaching and through a lot of the work that he did for this country to get us past and away from a lot of sin and a lot of oppression on behalf of African Americans to start with. When Martin Luther King was murdered in 1968, he was working on the Poor People's Campaign. And part of his desire to move in that direction was recognizing that even though the work to establish civil rights for African American and oppressed communities in our country was momentous and it was important and it needed to be done, he was beginning to make a lot of connections between what that work accomplished and what was left after that work was accomplished, and how that work was connected to other needs that our country continued to experience. And he particularly talked about doing the Watts riots, being able to recognized that the civil rights work that he had done did not fulfill the needs of African American young men and women in many communities in our country, and what was missing as a result of that. And so he started talking about the revolutionary power or the revolutionary concept of beloved community. Beloved community being what he envisioned as a society based on justice, equal opportunity, and love of one's fellow human beings. Beloved community being a fight for economic and social justice. Beloved community being rooted and centered in inclusivity, and really rooted and centered on the idea of mutuality. Some of us are very familiar with the quote that my liberation is bound in yours. That when I'm free, when I'm not free, you're not free. When you're not free, I'm not free. And he recognized that there was what he described as an inescapable network of mutuality that binds all of us. And when we do work in isolation, we fail to recognize that we have ripple effects across all of those communities. And therefore, our work is not about just fighting and resisting against the state. Our work should be about transformation so that we can achieve the beloved community. My thoughts about beloved community have been influenced a lot by Martin Luther King, obviously, but also a lot about Malcolm X and the revolutionary commitment that he demonstrated through his life of self-reflection and growth. It's also influenced by an activist named Lee Boggs, who really then was also influenced by these two activists and developed her own thinking and talked about a concept called dialectical thinking. And so beloved community is important in so many ways for us to agree on the type of world that we want to create and the work that we do as ways to get there, to create a community where all of us are accepted and all of us have our needs met and all of us are included and all of our lives matter. But in order to get to beloved community, Martin Luther King and Lee Boggs and Malcolm X talked a lot about the importance of differentiating the type of actions that are necessary to get us there, and really talked about differentiating resistance from revolution, from evolution, and then from radical imagination that leads to dialectical thinking. And Lee Boggs in particular, a lot of people would look for her for mentorship when they were organizing and beginning to resist and to make demands of the state. And her position, her and her husband did a lot of work in Detroit. Her position on that was always that we need to push ourselves to think radically and imagine a world that looks like the world that we need to be fighting for. And it's our duty not just to make demands of the state, it's to resist against what is in front of us. It is our duty to imagine that future and then to begin acting in ways that make that future come true. And often that it's not enough to say to those who oppress us, stop, or that I want you to give this to me, that we have to figure out how to begin creating the solutions that will lead us to freedom. And so when I was reading again about the idea of beloved community and where I've seen it expressed and what it requires of us, I was brought back to that thinking and the challenging of dialectical thinking. The idea that in order for us to be free and in order for us to be successful, we have to engage in radical thinking and radical imagination. I'm so glad to hear that there's going to be a space for us to be creative and a space for us to be in nature, obviously, but a space for us to let our creative juices flow. Part of what I mentioned that is because I'm learning a lot through this work about the importance of being in spaces that activate our imagination. Oftentimes, we are really bogged down by the soberness of the work ahead of us. And without practicing what it means to trigger our imagination and to lose some of that control and to let go of what we know and to begin creating and being able to transfer those skills into our activism, we are not able to activate our radical thinking. And without activating that radical thinking, we will not be able to imagine the future. And without being able to imagine the future that we need, we won't be able to try out new models that challenge those that fail to acknowledge our humanity, which is what Beloved Community does. And so having this, reading and seeing the interaction between these three momentous activists in our community who have since passed away, two of whom were murdered for the work that they were doing. Grace Lee Boggs lived a long life. She died when she was 100 years old, but the world that she was imagining was still not realized, even though she worked really hard to influence and shape old and young people to make that world happen. And so I want to talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice. We have a lot of examples of radical thinking and activated radical imagination and dialectical thinking here in this room. I don't think I've spent some time making the link between radical thinking and imagination and dialectical thinking. Grace Lee Boggs defines dialectical thinking as the idea that we can be very aware of the things that need to change in our world, and we should always organize and make sure that we are speaking against and we're speaking for ourselves and for those who are oppressed. But at the same time, we need to activate our radical thinking and our imagination to begin creating the solutions that recognize our humanity. And that requires self-transformation before we're able to achieve any type of structural transformation. And so I don't know where you all land on the political spectrum, but I'm very comfortable talking about where I land in the political spectrum. I was floored and shocked and hurt and dismayed by the Trump election during election day. I remember exactly where I was. I was crouched in the corner of a couch, cradling a glass of whiskey because a part of me knew where it was all going to end up, but I was still in this moment of shock. And I remember being so angry and being so sad and being so overwhelmed by what it meant that we were in this part of our history in this country and we were alive to be in it. And my husband, Ryan Lugalia-Hollon, who you may notice is a Caucasian American, love of my life, and I'm Kenyan. I was born and raised in Kenya. I am a naturalized citizen in America. But when his, I think, own processing of that decision, Ryan looked at me and he said, you know, Kenya accepts dual citizenship. America does not recognize dual citizenship, but if you're Kenyan and if you're married to a Kenyan, you can apply for Kenyan citizenship as well. And he was like, this might be the time to activate our Kenyan citizenship. And in my anger, I remember I looked at him and I was like, you saw what the numbers said? Black people did the right thing. This is your problem. These are your people. Y'all did this. You're staying. If anyone's going to Kenya, it's me and our brown children. And so that was where I was. The journey is not always perfect, but that's how I felt at the time. And we also happen to go to a church that is predominantly white. I am one of the few black people that attends that church. It is a very different brand of religion than the one that I was raised in. I was raised very Holy Ghost-filled, Pentecostal. If no one was catching the Holy Spirit or there are no demons being cast in the aisles at church, church did not happen. And I go to a very different experience now where I have not seen that in a minute. And so it's been a different orientation in addition to being oriented to America to recognize that this is my church family. And around the time the election happened, I recognized that a lot of the people that I sat with in those pews, who I hugged and said that they cared about me and I cared about them. I remember going into, maybe we didn't go to church for a couple of weeks probably, but going back and realizing how many of them had voted for Trump, and my translation of that had voted against my interests and my values and who I am and what I need in this community. And I remember, my internal dialogue, which had a touch of immaturity, and it just kind of being like, you don't care about me. Anytime someone attempted to hug me or talk to me with loving kindness, and felt a strong desire to reject and move away from those spaces, to recoil and to push away and to say, I don't belong here, I feel it. And I'm leaving, and you don't deserve me, and I don't deserve this. But revisiting these texts and thinking about the idea of beloved community really challenged what that meant for me in practice. And it wasn't easy. But even though the decision to reject and leave, and I felt very justified to burn it all down and leave and start somewhere else, was very strong. And I felt like if we moved in that direction, maybe even moved to Kenya, I would feel good about that. Recognize that the challenge of being in a beloved, recognizing that you are in beloved community, is accepting the mutuality between me and even those that voted against what I thought were my values and my interests. That if I accept that their liberation is bound up in mine, I also have to accept the responsibility of not just tapping into and centering around my liberation, but recognizing that I will never be free until they're free, and that there is some responsibility that lies with me, whether I feel that's unfair or not, and I can choose to pick it up and I can choose to put it down. There is some responsibility for that community that I need to lean into. And so we made a decision at that point to start a ministry at the church called the Micah 6:8 ministry. And that ministry, for my purposes, I think, was my desire to begin to lean into that mutuality, to recognize that there's a lot of gaps between how people think they're showing up in the world and what they believe in and what they value. And what role can we play as a church to begin bringing folks, in the same way that Patton has shared today, closer to the issues that they voted against, and so that they can learn and understand what leads to those issues, what causes poverty, what causes addiction, what causes homelessness, what causes educational inequality, and hopefully that in that process of awareness raising and education, people are made less comfortable because of the truth and are aware of what really works when it comes to not just their votes, but what we can begin to expect from our communities and ourselves. And so that was an attempt, I think, for me to tap into and practice dialectical thinking. We have great example here with the Folses who have made their lives an example as well. John Garland didn't wait, and his church didn't wait for the city of San Antonio or for the state of Texas or for the federal government to tell him how exactly he needed to react to the immigration crisis that San Antonio was experiencing. He created the solutions through his church and his congregation that he wanted to see in his community because he was aware of what he needed to do. And that is the difference between taking the time to make demands of the state and waiting for that to be the solution, to tapping into your own power and recognizing that the love and the power that you have is capable of creating the solutions that are fueled by your radical imagination that can address the issues of our day. And I want to end by sharing a couple of quotes from some of the reading that I did in preparation of this conversation, preparation for this conversation, some of them from Martin Luther King, some of them from Grace Lee Boggs, and some of them certainly from Martin Luther King's preaching. The first one is, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. In one of his last sermons, when talking about being the idea of mutuality, he also shared and quoted John Donne. No man is an island entire to itself. Every man is a piece of the continent and of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. Therefore, never send to know from whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. And this was from an article about Grace Lee Boggs. This is what true revolutions are about. We have to give birth to a new society based on more human values. They're about redefining our relationships with one another, to the earth, and to the world, about creating a new society in the places and spaces left vacant by the disintegration of the old, about hope, not despair, about saying yes to life and not to war, about finding the courage to love and care for the peoples of the world as we love and care for our own families. King's revolutionary vision is about each of us becoming the change we want to see in the world. And it's about us remembering that our self-transformation is really tied to the type of revolution and evolution we expect in the world. And that is a type of transformation that leads to structure transformation. That's what beloved community requires of us. Not just the self-transformation and the creativity that comes with that then leads to structural transformation, but an ignition of our radical thinking and our imagination so that we can get as close as possible to the type of dialectical thinking that allows us to bind ourselves to each other and co-create the realities that we need to see in our world. And to use a very, very overused cliche, we are the ones that we've been waiting for, and our imaginations are important to create that. Thank you.